The Vicar's Wife kept 2 diaries, a Miss Marple case. Chapter 1. The Wrong Bottle. The fog came down over Little Hadbury on the last Tuesday of October, the way it did most years, rolling off the water meadows and settling in the churchyard like something that had been asked to wait there and had simply decided to stay. Miss Marple noticed it from her sitting-room window at 4:30 and thought, not for the first time, that fog suited a village better than sunshine. Sunshine showed you everything at once. Fog made you look twice. She was not thinking about murder. She was thinking about her nephew Raymond's last letter and whether the wool she'd ordered for Mrs. Bantry's christening shawl would arrive before Friday, and whether Mr. Pruitt, the choirmaster, would manage to get through Thursday's rehearsal without losing his temper at the trebles. Little Hadbury, that autumn, was much as it had always been, a huddle of grey stone cottages along a single winding street, a green with a horse trough no horse had drunk from in 20 years, a church whose square tower had watched over harvests and hard winters alike since long before anyone now living could remember. The harvest itself had been brought in early that year, ahead of the weather, and the village had settled, as it always did in late October, into the particular contented business of preparing for the harvest supper and the first frosts and the long, dark stretch toward Christmas. Nothing, on the surface of things, suggested that Little Hadbury was a village capable of harbouring anything worse than the usual small quarrels over pew rents and flower rotas. He did not get through Thursday's rehearsal. He did not attend it at all. At 6 o'clock that evening, in the vestry of St. Aldhelm's, Arthur Pruitt was found by the sexton's boy, slumped over the small table where he kept his tuning fork and his cough lozenges, and, that week, a brown medicine bottle prescribed by Dr. Haverford for a chest complaint that had been troubling him since the harvest. The boy, whose name was Tommy Renfield and who was 11 and would tell the story for the rest of his life with steadily improving detail, ran the whole length of Church Lane without his cap, shouting that the choirmaster was dead. He was quite right. Arthur Pruitt was dead, and had been for perhaps 40 minutes, and beside his outflung hand lay the brown bottle, uncorked, with perhaps a third of its contents gone. It looked, everyone agreed afterward, exactly like what it was supposed to look like. A tired man of 56, alone in a cold vestry, taking rather too much of his medicine on an empty stomach and a weak heart, and dying of it. Dr. Haverford called at once, said as much, gently, to the small crowd that had gathered in the lane. Gardeners, choir members, the verger's wife with her hair still in curling pins under her scarf. The choir boys, still in their outdoor coats, stood in a frightened, silent cluster by the lich gate, and it was one of the smaller ones, a boy of 9, who began quietly to cry, not from any particular grief for a choirmaster who had never been especially kind to him, but from the plain shock of seeing, for the first time in his short life, what death actually looked like when it was not safely contained within a hymn or a Sunday sermon. It was Miss Marple, arriving rather later than the others, drawn by the commotion the way one is drawn by the sound of a dropped tray, who stood at the vestry door for a long moment and said nothing at all, but noticed that Arthur Pruitt's spectacles, which he wore for reading music and which he never went anywhere without, were nowhere on his person, nor on the table, nor on the floor near him. She noticed, too, the particular angle at which he had fallen, not the collapse of a man overcome gradually, slumping by degrees, but something closer to a sudden pitching forward, as though whatever had struck him had struck with very little warning at all. She did not mention this to anyone. Not yet. There is a time for mentioning things, and a crowded vestry with a body still warm in it is very rarely that time. Chapter 2. What the Village Said. By Friday morning, Little Hadbury had already tried, convicted, and half forgiven Arthur Pruitt of his own death. "Overdid the medicine, poor man," said Mrs. Latching at the post office, weighing out stamps for Miss Marple with the particular relish of a woman who has been first with the news 3 days running. Dr. Haverford said his heart was as weak as a kitten's. Everyone knew it. He'd gone quite grey at evensong only last month. "Did he seem unwell on Thursday?" Miss Marple asked, mildly. "Unwell," tired, cross as two sticks. He'd had words with young Mr. Annesley about the tenor line, I heard, and with Miss Dovewell about the flowers being left on the vestry table where they dripped on his music. Mrs. Latching lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the shop, and of course there was the other business, the letters. Letters from London, every week for a month, regular as church bells, and Pruitt going quite white when he opened them, so the verger says. Nobody knows what was in them, but he knew, and it wasn't good news, whatever it was. Poor Mr. Pruitt, Mrs. Latching added, weighing out a second sheet of stamps Miss Marple had not asked for, and setting them aside with the air of a woman who intends to be reimbursed whether they are wanted or not. For all his sharp tongue, he did a great deal for this parish, choir-wise, though I will say, and you'll think me unkind for saying it, Miss Marple, so soon after, there was always something of the schoolmaster about him that never quite left off, even with grown men and women. I like to know things about people. I liked it a good deal more than was entirely comfortable, if you take my meaning, and I don't say that only because he once told Ernest his bass line wanted more backbone in front of the whole choir. Miss Marple, who took her meaning very well indeed, bought her stamps and walked home slowly through the thinning fog, turning this over. A man dead of his own medicine, taken by accident, that was Dr. Haverford's view, and the view of most of the village, and it was tidy and comforting, and exactly the sort of explanation a small place likes to settle upon quickly, so that it may go back to worrying about the flower show and the state of the church roof. But there were spectacles, and there was the small persistent fact, which Miss Marple had learned from 40 years of watching people take medicine, that Arthur Pruitt could not read the label on a brown bottle without his spectacles, and would no more have measured out a dose blind than he would have conducted the choir blindfolded. She said nothing of this at the inquest, which returned, unsurprisingly, a verdict of misadventure. She said nothing of it to Dr. Haverford, who was a kind man, and overworked and inclined, as kind, overworked men often are, to accept the first explanation that spares everyone further trouble. She mentioned it, eventually, only to Inspector Slack's replacement, a younger, more patient man named Detective Inspector Corby, newly come to the district, and not yet certain whether Miss Marple was a harmless old lady or something rather more useful. He would learn. Before that, though, there was the verger to be called upon, for the verger, Mr. Hobden, was a man who noticed a great deal and repeated very little, which made him, in Miss Marple's long experience, exactly the sort of person worth troubling to visit twice. She found him in the churchyard, clipping the last of the summer's growth from around the older headstones with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had held the same post for 30 years and expected to hold it 30 more. He straightened when he saw her, touched his cap, and went on clipping, which Miss Marple took, correctly, as an invitation to talk rather than a dismissal. "You mentioned the letters to Mrs. Latching, Mr. Hobden," she said, coming to stand beside him. "The ones from London that troubled Mr. Pruitt so. Didn't mean it to go round the village so fast, if I'm honest, Miss Marple. But there, the woman can't help herself, and I dare say I oughtn't have said anything at all." He clipped a stray bramble with rather more force than the task required. 4 of them there were, over the last month, always the same hand on the envelope, small, cramped sort of writing. A clerk's hand, I'd say, having seen a good many in my time doing the parish accounts. And Mr. Pruitt always took them off to read alone in the vestry, never opened one in front of anybody, which a man doesn't do unless he's got reason to mind who sees his face while he reads it. Did he ever say what troubled him so? Not to me. But I'll tell you this, Miss Marple, and you may make of it what you will. The Thursday he died, there was a 5th letter came by the afternoon post, and I carried it up to the vestry myself along with the choir music, and he went white as that headstone there the moment he saw the hand on it, whiter than I'd seen him go with any of the others. Didn't open it while I was in the room, just holding it, staring at it, the way a man holds a thing he already half knows the contents of and would give a good deal not to have to confirm. And that letter, Mr. Hobden, was it found among his effects afterward? The verger paused in his clipping for the first time and looked at her properly. "Now that you ask it plain, Miss Marple, I couldn't say that it was. I've thought about it since, once or twice, in an idle sort of way, but I never thought to mention it to the inspector. There seemed nothing criminal in a letter, simply not being where a body expects to find it. Man might have put it in his coat, or burned it, or 100 other ordinary things. He resumed his clipping, though rather more slowly than before. But no, now I turn my mind to it properly, I don't believe that letter was ever found at all. Chapter 3. The Vicarage Tea. The Reverend Michael Aldous and his wife, Prudence, held their weekly open tea on Saturdays, and it was there, 3 days after Pruitt's death, that Miss Marple went to look, though she would have said, if asked, that she went only for the seed cake, which Prudence Aldous made better than anyone in 3 parishes. The vicarage drawing-room was full of the particular hush of a village still deciding how much grief it was permitted to feel over a man not much loved but respectably regarded. A fire had been lit against the autumn chill, and the long windows, usually left open to the garden even this late in the year, were shut fast against the fog that pressed grey and patient at the glass, so that the whole room had the close, muffled feeling of a place cut off from the rest of the world for the length of an afternoon. Prudence poured tea with a steadiness that Miss Marple found, in its way, rather interesting, for Prudence Aldous was not, by temperament, a steady woman. She was quick, watchful, given to sudden bright laughter that stopped as suddenly as it started, and this afternoon she was pale beneath her rogue, and her hand, once, trembled enough to rattle the cup against its saucer. "You knew Mr. Pruitt a long time, Mrs. Aldous," Miss Marple said, accepting her cake. "Since before the war, I think Mrs. Latching said. Since we came to the parish, 11 years. Prudence's smile did not quite reach her eyes. He was difficult, but he was a good musician. The choir will miss him at Christmas most of all. He always did such wonderful things with the descendant. He seemed troubled lately. Letters from London, I understand." The teapot, which Prudence had been about to set down, paused in the air a fraction too long. "I wouldn't know anything about his correspondence, Miss Marple." Her voice was perfectly pleasant. It was also, Miss Marple thought, exactly 1/2 tone too pleasant, the way a voice goes when its owner has rehearsed the sentence beforehand. "Michael, do come and settle the argument about the harvest festival flowers. Miss Dovewell says lilies, and I'm quite sure we agreed on chrysanthemums." The vicar came, mild and a little vague as always, and the conversation moved elsewhere, and Miss Marple ate her seed cake and watched Prudence Aldous move about her own drawing-room with the bright, brittle competence of a woman keeping several plates spinning at once, and terrified of which one might fall. Before the Colonel spoke, however, there was Miss Hetty Skirrow to be got past, the church organist's assistant, a thin, eager young woman, new enough to the village that she still felt obliged to fill every silence, who cornered Miss Marple by the window-seat with a great deal to say about very little. "It's given me quite a turn. I don't mind telling you, Miss Marple, having to take the harmonium alone at evensong with Mr. Pruitt gone. Not that I'm not grateful for the chance. One does so want to be given a chance. But it does seem dreadfully callous to be grateful for anything just now, doesn't it, with the poor man not a fortnight in his grave?" She lowered her voice, glancing toward the tea-table. "Do you know, I always thought there was something a little cold about him, for all his fine talk of Christian charity in the choir-room. Sharp with the trebles, sharper still with anyone he thought beneath him musically, and I did hear him say once, quite plainly, that he'd known a good many people in this village pretend to be a good deal better than they were, and that he intended, one of these days, to see 1 or 2 of them properly unmasked. I thought it a queer, unchristian sort of thing for a choir-master to say, and I've thought of it a good deal since." "When did he say this, Miss Skirrow?" "Oh, weeks back, before the letters started, I think, or just as they began. I didn't think anything of it at the time. One doesn't, does one, until afterward." She gave a small, nervous laugh and moved away toward the cake stand, leaving Miss Marple to reflect that Arthur Pruitt had apparently made no particular secret, among those inclined to listen closely, of harbouring some private grievance against the village's carefully maintained appearances, a fact that widened, rather than narrowed, the circle of those who might have wished him silent. It was old Colonel Bantry, of all people, standing by the fire with a cup he wasn't drinking, who said the thing that stayed with her. "Shocking business, Pruitt. Though I'll tell you what's odd. I passed the vestry Thursday evening, about 5:30, on my way back from the shoot. Saw a light on, and a woman's shape at the window. Thought nothing of it. Flowers for Sunday, I supposed. Didn't think to mention it to the police, there being nothing in it. But it stayed with me, rather. Did you see who it was, Colonel? Miss Marple asked. Couldn't say. The fog was down already. Just a shape, moving quickly, like someone who didn't want to be seen taking their time about it. He shrugged. Might have been anybody. Half the village women go in and out of that vestry for one reason or another. Miss Marple thought this a very interesting piece of information, and resolved to find out, quietly and without appearing to try very hard, exactly which women had reason to be in the vestry on a Thursday evening, and which of them might have wished to be quick about it, and unseen. Chapter 4. The Obvious Man. Detective Inspector Corby, it turned out, had already settled on his man by Monday, and his man was young Simon Annesley, the tenor. Corby was new enough to the district, barely 8 months in post, transferred out from a town posting that had left him, Miss Marple gathered, with a taste for tidy files and swift conclusions, that he had not yet learned the particular patience a village murder demands, the willingness to sit with a great many small, contradictory facts for a good deal longer than any city inspector's caseload would ordinarily allow. He was not an unintelligent man, nor an unkind one, but he had the confidence of youth and a clean record, and both, Miss Marple suspected, would serve him considerably better once tempered by a failure or two. Motive as plain as your face, ma'am, he told Miss Marple, with the slightly defensive courtesy of a policeman who has been advised, by someone he trusts, to take the old lady seriously and isn't sure he wants to. Pruitt threw him out of the choir solo not 10 days back, humiliated him in front of the whole village at rehearsal, from what I hear, said his voice had gone to nothing, and he'd do better in the back row with the basses. Annesley's proud, wants to sing professionally, so they say, and Pruitt's opinion carried weight with the sort of people who might have helped him, and Annesley was seen arguing with Pruitt on the Thursday itself, not 2 hours before he died. Was he indeed? Miss Marple folded her hands. And did anyone see him near the vestry at the time Mr. Pruitt actually died? No, Corby admitted. Says he was walking on the Hadbury Road, alone, thinking. No one to back him up, which is either the truth or the feeblest excuse I've heard this year. It is very often both, said Miss Marple. The truth and a feeble excuse. Innocent people are dreadfully bad at providing themselves with alibis, Inspector, because it has never occurred to them that they might need one. Only the guilty think to arrange a witness in advance, and even then they generally arrange it badly, from nerves. She paused. Did Mr. Pruitt take sugar in anything that afternoon? Tea, perhaps? Corby looked at her as though she had asked whether the moon was made of cheese. Sugar, ma'am? It's only that a man dying of an overdose of his own medicine, alone, unwitnessed, in his own vestry. It is a very tidy sort of death, Inspector. Tidy deaths make me want to look at the seams. Was there a teacup in the vestry? There had been. Dr. Haverford's notes, dug out at Miss Marple's gentle insistence, recorded a single cup, half drunk, on the window-sill. Its contents never tested because no one had thought, at the time, that there was anything to test for. I would be very glad, said Miss Marple, if someone could discover, even now, whether that cup can tell us anything at all. Chapter 5. 2 interviews and a weak heart. Miss Marple found Simon Annesley in his mother's front garden, staking the last of the dahlias against the coming frost with the fierce, unnecessary energy of a young man trying very hard not to think about something else entirely. I didn't kill him, Miss Marple, whatever the inspector fancies, he said, before she had properly finished her greeting, driving a stake into the soft earth with rather more force than the dahlia required. I'll own what I want to. He stood up in front of the whole choir and told me I sang like a curate with a cold, and I've been trying for 2 years to get a place with the cathedral choir at Milchester, and Pruitt's word would have carried weight with them, being an examiner there himself. He was as good as told me he'd see I never got it. I said some hard things back to him at the church gate, and I don't doubt half the village heard me say them, but I walked the Hadbury Road after, same as I told the inspector, because I was too angry to go home and sit at supper as though nothing had happened, and there's no one to swear to because I met not a soul the whole way, the fog being down. Was there anything in what Mr. Pruitt said to you? beyond the matter of your voice, Mr. Annesley? Anything that struck you as odd or unlike him?" Annesley paused, stake half-driven, and frowned. "Now you mention it, he did say one queer thing, right at the end, as I was walking off. Called after me that I needn't think myself the only one in the village with something to hide, and that some people's secrets were a good deal older and uglier than a boy's wounded pride about his singing voice. I thought it was just spite at the time, said to sting me, but it's stuck with me since, the way a strange thing does." Miss Marple thought this a very interesting confirmation of what Miss Scarrow had already suggested, that Arthur Pruitt had gone about the village that final fortnight, not merely burdened by one secret discovery, but rather pleased with himself for possessing it, in the particular unattractive way of a man who has found power in knowledge and cannot resist letting others glimpse that he holds it, even while withholding its substance. She thanked Annesley, wished him better luck with the cathedral choir than his temper had lately earned him, and went on to Dr. Haverford's surgery, where she found the doctor between patients, looking, as he generally did by 4 in the afternoon, thoroughly worn through. "I've thought about little else since the inquest, Miss Marple, if you want the truth of it," he admitted, waving her to the patient's chair rather than his own, being too tired to observe the usual courtesies. "A misadventure verdict satisfies a jury, but it's never quite satisfied me, and I'll tell you why, since you've clearly not come merely to inquire after my health." Pruitt's heart was weak, yes, genuinely weak. I'd treated him for 2 years, but the dose that killed him was a very great deal more than even a careless, half-blind man measuring by guesswork would ordinarily take. I put it down, at the time, to a man in some distress taking more than he ought, in hope of quicker relief. People do, but it troubled me that the quantity was so very much more than distress alone generally accounts for. Could such a quantity have come from the bottle alone, Dr. Haverford, however carelessly measured, or would it want something added? The doctor looked at her for a long moment, his tiredness giving way, briefly, to something sharper. "You've been thinking exactly what I've been afraid to say aloud to Inspector Corby, for want of proof to back it," he said slowly. "The bottle I prescribed held a standard tincture, strong enough in overdose certainly, but not, I think, strong enough alone to produce quite what I saw in that vestry, not without some further substance added to it. Something more concentrated, another person's heart medicine, say, added to his own, would do it very well indeed, and would show up, on a proper analysis, as nothing more than an unusually potent dose of the very drug he was already known to take, which is precisely why nobody thought to look closer at the time. It's a clever way to kill a man, Miss Marple, if you'll forgive the word for such a grim subject. It hides inside the ordinary. And how many of your patients in Little Hadbury take such a preparation themselves, Dr. Haverford? For their own hearts, I mean." The doctor considered this, running a tired hand across his eyes. "A dozen perhaps of an age to need it. Old Mr. Pargeter at the haberdasher's, Mrs. Bantry's cook, though I doubt she'd know a fatal dose from a headache powder. Miss Dovewell, come to that, though she's scarcely needed hers in years, being a good deal steadier than most her age." He paused, and something in his tired face sharpened further still, as though the naming of it aloud had brought some private suspicion of his own a little closer to the surface than he had quite intended. "I don't say that means anything at all, Miss Marple. A dozen names is a dozen names, and most of them women old enough to be entirely above suspicion of anything more violent than a sharp word over the vicarage cake stand." "Most of them, Dr. Haverford," Miss Marple agreed, gathering her gloves, "though not, I think, quite all." "It generally does, Dr. Haverford," said Miss Marple, rising to go. "That is rather the difficulty with most clever things." Chapter 6. A Contradiction in Times. It was Miss Dovewell, small, anxious, devoted entirely to the flower rota and the memory of a fiancé lost at the Somme 38 years before, who supplied, without in the least intending to, the thread that Miss Marple began, quietly, to pull. "I was in the vestry myself, Thursday, about 5:15, Miss Dovewell told her, over the wool counter at the haberdasher's, wringing her hands in the particular way of a gentle woman who has realized, belatedly, that she may be a suspect. "Bringing in the chrysanthemums for the harvest table. Mr. Pruitt was there, quite alive, quite cross about the flowers dripping, exactly as Mrs. Latching says. I left directly. I couldn't have been there for 5 minutes. The haberdasher's was a small, crowded shop, smelling of new wool and lavender bags, and old Mr. Pargeter behind the counter went on measuring out ribbon with the studied indifference of a man who has learned, over 40 years of trade, exactly how much of a conversation he is permitted to overhear without appearing to listen to any of it. Miss Marple, turning over a card of buttons she had no real need of, kept her voice as light and unremarkable as the shop itself. "And you'd no reason to go back later in the evening, I suppose? Sometimes the flowers want writing again, once the vestry's been walked through a few times." "Oh, no indeed. I went straight home to my supper, and thought no more of the flowers till Sunday." Miss Dovewell's hands, Miss Marple noticed, had gone very still over the wool she was choosing, the particular stillness of a person taking great care not to fumble anything under close observation. It was such a shock hearing what had happened when Mrs. Latching told me Friday morning. I could scarcely credit it, him standing there so cross and lively not an hour before, over a few dripped petals. "And you're quite sure of the time, Miss Dovewell?" "Oh, quite. I remember because the church clock struck the quarter as I came out, and I thought, there, I shall just catch the 5:20 bus if I hurry, and I did catch it. Mrs. Fenwick will tell you, she was on it too." This was, on its face, unremarkable, but Miss Marple, walking home with her wool, found it snagged against something else entirely, for Colonel Bantry had placed his mysterious light and hurrying shape at the vestry window at 5:30, a full quarter hour after Miss Dovewell had already left, and caught her bus, and been seen doing so by a second witness. And Simon Annesley, by his own account and by 2 others who had, on further inquiry, seen him from a distance on the Hadbury Road, had quarrelled with Pruitt at the church gate at 5 o'clock exactly, before storming off toward the fields, well before Miss Dovewell's chrysanthemums, well before the Colonel's shape at the window, and nearly an hour, by every account, before Dr. Haverford placed the time of death at somewhere near 6:45. Someone, then, had been in that vestry between 5:30 and 6:45, after Miss Dovewell, after young Annesley's quarrel, and had not come forward to say so. Miss Marple sat a long while over her knitting that evening, her needles quite still in her lap, thinking not about who might have wished Arthur Pruitt dead, which was, she suspected, a longer list than anyone in Little Hadbury cared to admit, but about who might have had a very particular reason to be seen leaving the church at one time, and yet return, unseen, an hour later, in the fog, when the light was down, and a woman's shape at a window might belong to almost anybody at all. She thought too, turning the puzzle over as she might turn a piece of knitting to check the pattern from the other side, that a village clock striking the quarter hour is a very ordinary sort of witness, relied upon by everybody and questioned by nobody, and that an alibi built upon its testimony was, for that very reason, exactly the sort that deserved a second, closer look before it was allowed to stand unchallenged. Chapter 7. The Spectacles in the Flower Shed. It was Tommy Renfield who found them, 3 days after the funeral, and he found them entirely by accident, which was rather the point, Miss Marple thought later, of most important discoveries in a village of this size. He had been sent to fetch the wicker baskets from the flower shed behind the church hall, the ones used for the harvest gifts, and in reaching for them on the high shelf, he had dislodged a folded gardening apron, and from the apron's pocket had fallen a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles, quite unbroken, quite ordinary, except that Tommy recognized them at once, because he had spent a great deal of the last fortnight thinking about exactly this object. "They're his," he told Miss Marple breathlessly, having run to her cottage rather than to the police, on the not unreasonable grounds that Miss Marple always seemed to know what to do with things. "Mr. Pruitt's spectacles, I'd know them anywhere. He had a bit of wire wound round the hinge where it broke, see, and mended it himself." Miss Marple looked at the spectacles for a long moment without touching them, and then wrapped them very carefully in her handkerchief. "And whose apron were they in, Tommy?" "That's just it." The boy's eyes were enormous. "It's Miss Dovewell's. She keeps it there for the flower rota. Everybody knows it's hers. It's got her initials worked on the pocket." It was, Miss Marple reflected, walking to the police house with the small bundle in her basket, exactly the sort of clue she distrusted most. Too neat, too easily found, too conveniently marked with initials for anyone at all to overlook. A murderer, clever enough to alter a medicine bottle without detection, was very unlikely to leave the victim's spectacles in her own marked apron, in a shed to which half the village had a key, which meant, she thought, that either Miss Dovewell was a good deal less clever than she appeared, or someone else wished, very much, for the spectacles to be found precisely where they were found. She said as much to Inspector Corby that afternoon, and had the satisfaction of watching him look, for the first time, faintly uncertain of his own excellent, obvious case. "You think someone's put them there to look guilty, ma'am? That's a rum sort of thing to do." "It is a very old sort of thing to do, Inspector, and it very often works, because policemen, if you will forgive me, are trained to look for evidence, and evidence, once found, is dreadfully persuasive. It takes a particular kind of stubbornness to ask not what this proves, but who benefits from my finding it." Corby, to his credit, took the point seriously enough to ask, that same afternoon, who besides Miss Dovewell had a key to the flower shed, and the answer, once gathered, proved a good deal less reassuring than either of them might have liked. "The shed was never locked at all in the ordinary way of things," the sexton explained, wiping his hands on his apron with the faint embarrassment of a man confessing to a lapse of security he had never before thought worth mentioning. "The flowers wanted airing, and the baskets were in and out so often through the week that locking up each time seemed more trouble than it was worth. Half the choir had been in and out of it at one time or another, fetching vases for the harvest table, and the door, in any case, stood in plain view of the churchyard path, where anyone coming or going after dark, in a fog thick enough to hide a face, might slip inside for the length of a held breath and slip out again unremarked. "Which tells us very little about who did put them there, Inspector," Miss Marple said, as they walked back along the path together, "but a great deal about how very little courage it would have taken to do it. One need not be clever to hide a thing in an unlocked shed. A host of one need only be quick and know that the shed exists, and know too whose apron hangs on the third peg from the door, which is to say, one need only be someone reasonably familiar with this village's small, ordinary habits, and there are a great many people, Inspector, who answer to that description." Chapter 8. Mrs. Fenwick and the 5:20 bus. Miss Marple found Mrs. Fenwick, who kept the sweet shop on the green, and rode the Hadbury bus every Thursday to visit her sister, arranging barley sugar in the window, with the particular concentration of a woman who has been asked the same question 3 times already that week, and is heartily sick of it. "Oh yes, Miss Dovewell was on the 5:20, right enough," Mrs. Fenwick said, not looking up from her barley sugar. "Sat 2 seats ahead of me, same as always. We always take that bus together on a Thursday, though we don't sit together. She likes her window seat, and I like the aisle, on account of my knee." "And she rode all the way with you?" "To Hadbury." Mrs. Fenwick's hands went still. "Well, no, now you mention it. She got down at the crossroads stop, same as she does sometimes, when she's got a message to run at the Hadbury crossroads shop before it shuts. I didn't think anything of it. She does it most weeks." "And how far is the crossroads stop from the church, Mrs. Fenwick?" "On the bus. 10 minutes. Near enough, with the fog slowing us that evening." Mrs. Fenwick looked up at last, and something uneasy crossed her broad, kind face. "But walking back, cutting through Hobbs Field and along the footpath by the mill, a body could do it in 15 minutes, I dare say, if they knew the way in the dark, and Miss Dovewell's walked that path her whole life. 15 minutes to walk back, 10 minutes on the bus to the crossroads. A woman seen boarding a bus at 5:30, verified, respectable, entirely accounted for, and yet with time enough, if she chose, to double back through the fog and arrive at the vestry window at very near the moment Colonel Bantry had seen his hurrying shape." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Fenwick, bought a 1/4 pound of barley sugar she did not particularly want, and walked home turning over a new and uncomfortable thought. Not that Miss Dovewell's alibi was false, exactly, but that it had been constructed, perhaps quite deliberately, to be almost true, true enough to satisfy a policeman who did not think to ask about crossroad stops and footpaths through Hobbs Field. She decided, the following afternoon, that a thing of this importance ought not to rest on Mrs. Fenwick's estimate of 15 minutes alone, and so she walked the path herself, in a stout pair of boots and her second-best coat, timing her steps by the small watch she had carried since her sister's wedding 40 years before. It was, she found, a pleasant enough walk in daylight, skirting the edge of Hobbs Field where the last of the barley stubble stood pale and cropped, and dropping down by a stile to follow the mill stream along a hedge thick with old man's beard, before climbing again to come out, quite suddenly, almost directly behind the churchyard wall. She could see, from part way along it, both the crossroads stop where the bus set down its passengers and the small lit window of the vestry itself. A coincidence of geography she suspected was no coincidence at all, but rather the very reason a woman needing to be in two places within the hour would have chosen, all those years ago, to make her home in a cottage at the end of Church Lane, rather than anywhere else in the village. 14 minutes, by her watch, walking briskly, but without hurrying enough to draw attention, had she met anyone on the way, and she met no one at all, for it was exactly the sort of path a person takes precisely because it is not the sort of path anyone else troubles to use. She stood a while at the churchyard wall afterward, looking at the vestry window, thinking of the fog that had lain over everything on the Thursday in question, thick enough, by every account, to blur a hurrying shape into something no witness could properly describe, and thought, not for the first time, how very well the weather itself sometimes seems to conspire with wickedness, though she knew, of course, that it did nothing of the kind, and that it was only that wickedness, being patient, generally knows how to wait for the right conditions before it acts. Chapter 9. An accident by the mill pond. The second shock, when it came to Tommy Renfield, and it came on a grey Tuesday morning, with the fog still lying thin over the water. He had gone, as boys will, to look at the mill pond on his way to school, wanting to see whether the ice had begun to skin over at the shallow end, and it was there that Constable Deering found him 20 minutes later, soaked to the chest and shivering violently, having been pulled from the water by a passing carter who had heard him shout. The carter, a broad, slow-spoken man named Ferris, who drove the coal cart twice weekly through Little Hadbury, told it afterward much the same way each time he was asked, which Miss Marple noted was rather more than could be said for most village witnesses. He had heard a splash and then a boy's voice, choked and frightened, and had gone over the hedge without stopping to think, wading into his waist, to haul Tommy out by the collar of his coat before the cold and the weight of his wet clothes could drag him under for good. Tommy's account, once he had been wrapped in blankets and given hot milk and had stopped shaking enough to speak, was confused but consistent on one point. He had not slipped. He had been standing well back from the edge, on the old millstone that served as a step, when something, he was quite certain it was a hand, though he had not seen a face, had struck him hard between the shoulders and sent him headlong into the black water. "Wouldn't credit a boy's fright," said Constable Deering, not unkindly. "Only the millstone's dry moss on top, ma'am, and there's no reason a lad would pitch himself backward off it unless he was pushed." Miss Marple, sitting beside Tommy's bed with a cup of beef tea she had brought over herself, asked him gently what he had told people, in the days since finding the spectacles, about where exactly he had found them. "Told most everyone, I expect," Tommy admitted, shamefaced. "Told the other choir boys. Told Mrs. Latching at the shop when she asked. Said how they were tucked right down in the pocket, under a ball of twine, like someone had pushed them in deep so they wouldn't be found by accident. Only I found them by accident anyhow, reaching for the baskets." Miss Marple set down her cup very carefully. "Tucked down deep, under the twine," she repeated. "Not simply fallen into the pocket, but pushed down and hidden. You're quite sure of that, Tommy?" "Certainly, Miss Marple. I had to dig for them properly." It was, she thought, walking home in the thin morning light, a very small correction to a story already told, and yet it changed everything. Spectacles that had fallen into a pocket by accident told one story. Spectacles that had been deliberately pushed down and hidden in an apron marked with initials told quite another, that someone had gone to considerable trouble to see that Miss Dovewell, and no one else, would be blamed, and that someone had been sufficiently alarmed by Tommy's talk of where exactly he'd found them to try, in the fog by the mill pond, to make quite sure the boy talked no further. The village, by evening, had worked itself into a state of considerable alarm, for there is nothing quite so unsettling to a small community as violence turned against a child, and the tea-tables of Little Hadbury that Tuesday night were full of a fear rather different from the mild, gossiping curiosity that had followed Pruitt's death. Mothers walked their children to school the next morning who had never troubled to walk them before. Mrs. Latching kept the post office door locked between customers, though no one could quite say what she imagined might come through it. And Detective Inspector Corby, to his credit, arrived at the conclusion Miss Marple had already reached some days earlier, that a village frightened enough to attack a schoolboy by a mill pond was a village in which the obvious, tidy explanation had very probably been wrong from the start. Miss Marple went to see Tommy's mother the following afternoon, ostensibly to bring a basket of early plums from her own garden, though in truth to ask, as gently as she could manage, whether Tommy had told anyone else, besides the choir boys and Mrs. Latching, precisely where the spectacles had been found. "He's told the whole village twice over, Miss Marple, and I've scolded him for it more than once, for all the good scolding does with a boy his age who's found himself the hero of the hour." Mrs. Renfield set the kettle on with hands that were not quite steady, 3 days on from the mill pond. "But I couldn't tell you exactly who heard it first, or who he told the particulars to, push down deep, twine on top and all that, because he's said it to half of Little Hadbury by now, standing on the green with the other boys round him like he'd found the crown jewels. And did he mention it, do you know, at the vicarage tea last Saturday, or to anyone connected with the Harvest Fund?" Mrs. Renfield considered this, frowning. "He was at the tea, yes, come to think of it. Ran errands for Mrs. Aldous with the cake stand, and I do recall him telling it all to Miss Dovewell herself, quite proud of himself, because she'd asked him direct, kind as anything, how he'd come to find them, being the one whose apron they were found in, poor soul, and wanting to know as much as anyone, I'd have thought, under the circumstances." Miss Marple thanked her and left the plums and walked home, turning over this last small fact with the particular care she gave to anything that seemed, at first hearing, entirely unremarkable. Miss Dovewell had asked the boy directly and kindly exactly the sort of question anyone in her unhappy position might reasonably have asked, and yet it was also, Miss Marple reflected, exactly the question a person needing very precisely to know how much danger a witness represented would think, quite naturally, to ask. Chapter 10. The Vicar's Wife Alone. It was Prudence Aldous herself, in the end, who came to Miss Marple, on the evening after Tommy's accident, arriving at the cottage door, white-faced, and without her coat properly buttoned, as though she had left the vicarage in something very near a panic. Miss Marple had been half expecting her, in the quiet, unhurried way she expected a great many things before they arrived, for she had watched Prudence Aldous grow paler and more watchful with every day that passed since the mill pond, watched her hands shake at the Harvest Committee meeting over nothing more alarming than a question about trestle tables, watched her flinch, once, quite visibly, when the church bell tolled the hour during Sunday service, as though any sudden sound now carried the freight of some private dread. A guilty conscience, Miss Marple had long observed, wears very much the same face whether the guilt in question belongs to murder or to something a good deal smaller and more human, and it had seemed to her only a matter of time before the smaller guilt, unable to bear its own weight any longer, came looking for somewhere safe to set itself down. "I have to tell someone," Prudence said now, sitting stiffly on the very edge of the offered chair, her tea untouched. "I should have told the inspector days ago, and I didn't, because I was afraid, and now that boy's nearly drowned, and I can't let that weigh on my conscience as well." "You were in the vestry that Thursday evening, Mrs. Aldous, at 5:30. Prudence's head came up sharply. "How did you—" "Colonel Bantry saw a shape at the window. I had wondered, rather, whether it might have been you." "It was." The words came out in a rush, as though a damn long straining had finally given way. "I went to beg him, Pruitt, not to send his letter. He'd found out about Michael's father, you see. My husband's father was not the man everyone believes. There was a scandal years before Michael was born, a first wife, still living, when Michael's father married again. It would have made Michael illegitimate in the eyes of half this parish, and ruined him utterly if it came out. A clergyman born out of true wedlock, whatever the law might say about it now. Pruitt had been corresponding with a solicitor's clerk in London, some idle genealogical hobby of his, tracing old parish scandals for his own amusement, he said, though I never believed it was only amusement, and he'd stumbled on the truth of it, and he meant to tell the bishop. And when you reached him, Mrs. Aldous, he was already ill. Prudence's voice dropped to nearly nothing, slumped over the table, breathing very strangely, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. God forgive me, I didn't call for help. I stood there and I thought, if he dies, my secret dies with him, and I let myself think it for perhaps 30 seconds before shame overtook me, and then I ran, because I heard someone coming, and I have been sick with the knowledge of it ever since, that I might have saved him and did not try. It was, Miss Marple thought, watching the woman's genuine and terrible distress, an entirely believable account of an entirely different crime, the crime of a moment's cowardice, not of murder. Prudence Aldous had arrived to find Arthur Pruitt already dying, poisoned by a hand that was not hers, at some time before 5:30, which meant the poison had done its work with dreadful speed, or, far more likely, Miss Marple thought, feeling the shape of the truth begin, at last, to gather itself in the fog, had been administered a good deal earlier than anyone had yet supposed, at very nearly 5:15, in fact, by a small, anxious woman with chrysanthemums in her basket, who had left the vestry in good time to catch her bus. Chapter 11. Miss Marple reconsiders the flowers. She went to the Harvest Fund records the next morning with the vicar's rather baffled permission, and sat a long while at the vestry table, the very table, though no one remarked on it, turning the pages of a small green account book kept, for 11 years, in Miss Dovewell's careful, spidery hand. The figures were meticulous. They were also, to an eye trained by decades of village bazaars and church fêtes, and the particular arithmetic of small charitable funds, very slightly wrong, not carelessly wrong, but wrong in the deliberate, controlled way of a column that has been made to balance rather than allowed to balance itself. A little here, a little there, over 11 years, amounting, Miss Marple judged, to a sum not enormous but far from trivial, enough, certainly, to matter a great deal to a woman living on a small annuity in a cottage she did not own. She thought, too, about the fiancé lost at the Somme, 38 years spoken of and never once, in all that time, named, no photograph shown, no letters produced, no visit ever paid to any grave. It was the sort of story a village accepts without question, because it is sad, and because it is not polite to press a grieving woman for particulars, and because, Miss Marple thought, with the faint, familiar sorrow of recognizing an old and well-worn human trick, a story too painful to discuss is also a story too painful to be doubted. She wrote a short letter that afternoon to an old friend from her days visiting a cousin in London, a woman connected, as so many of Miss Marple's correspondents seemed to be, with parish records and old newspaper files, and asked, with apologies for the trouble, whether anything at all could be found regarding a Miss Alice Dovewell, or perhaps a name very like it, in the records of a particular London parish, in the years just after the First War. Chapter 12. The ones who were elsewhere before she posted the letter, though Miss Marple thought it wise to be quite certain she was not, once again, mistaking a tidy shape for the true one, and so she spent the better part of 2 further days making entirely unhurried, entirely unremarkable calls about the village, with her knitting bag over her arm, and no purpose that anyone watching could have named. She called first upon Colonel Bantry, ostensibly to return a book on roses his wife had lent her the previous spring, and turned the conversation, gently, to the matter of his own movements that Thursday evening. Came straight home from the shoot, same as any Thursday, and my man Peters will vouch for me from 5:30 onward, for I was cleaning the guns with him in the gun-room till gone 6. Grumbling the whole while about the fog spoiling the last drive. The Colonel looked faintly affronted at being asked, though not, Miss Marple noted, remotely alarmed. "Surely you don't suspect me, Miss Marple? of doing away with the choir master over a hymn tune. Not for a moment, Colonel. I only wish to be quite sure of the order of things, and you have been very helpful in being sure of it yourself. She meant it kindly, and it happened also to be true. A man who volunteers, unprompted and unbothered, a servant able to confirm his whereabouts, is very rarely a man troubled by the question, whereas a guilty man, Miss Marple had generally found, either declines to answer at all, or answers with a great deal more detail than the question strictly required. She called next upon Mr. Hobden in his small cottage by the Lich Gate, and found him mending a length of surplice with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything. "I was at home from 5 o'clock onward, Miss Marple, laid up with my back, which had been troubling me all that week. My wife will tell you the same, and old Dr. Haverford besides, for he called round that very evening to look at it, being a friend as much as a physician to this house." He shook his head slowly over his needle. "I've turned that Thursday over and over since, wondering what I might have seen or done differently, carrying that last letter up as I did, but I was flat on my back with a hot poultice by 4:30, and never stirred from it till the boy came running with his news." Both accounts, checked quietly against the servant, the wife, and the doctor, proved entirely sound, and Miss Marple crossed 2 names from the small private list she carried, not on paper, but in the orderly, patient corner of her mind, reserved for exactly such bookkeeping. Simon Annesley she had already set gently aside, his temper being real, but his alibi, however unwitnessed, entirely consistent with an innocent man, too angry to think of manufacturing one. She called last upon Miss Hetty Skirrow in the small rooms she rented above the draper's shop, and found her surrounded by sheet music and hymnal proofs, thoroughly and cheerfully unguarded. "Home practising the descant, Miss Marple, the whole of that dreadful evening, and my landlady will tell you so. She complained of it through the floorboards until gone 8 o'clock, said she'd never heard 'Now Thank We All Our God' played so many times in a single sitting, and hoped never to again." She laughed, a little nervously, at her own joke, and then sobered. "I know I talk a great deal, and I know it must look odd, a newcomer running on so about a man I'd known scarcely 6 months. But I promise you, Miss Marple, whatever queer things Mr. Pruitt said about unmasking people, he never once said them about me. I'd nothing to hide from him. I'd only just arrived." Miss Marple believed her, and the landlady, sought out separately, confirmed the account down to the particular hymn and the particular hour, and so a 4th name was set gently aside, leaving Prudence Aldous a question mark still, her nervousness at the tea-table unexplained but not. Miss Marple felt quite the nervousness of murder, and one name remaining whose alibi, on close examination, proved to be built not of solid fact, but of a bus timetable and a footpath through Hobbs Field, arranged, whether by accident or design, to look very much more solid than it truly was. Then she put on her coat and went to find Detective Inspector Corby, for she had begun, at last, to see the whole shape of the thing, not merely who, but why, and how a woman who wept so convincingly over a fiancé 38 years dead might also, with perfectly steady hands, have measured a fatal dose into a brown bottle and gone to catch her bus. Chapter 13. A Letter from London. The reply came 6 days later, on a morning bright and hard after a week of fog, in an envelope addressed in a small, cramped, entirely legible hand that Miss Marple recognised at once as belonging to her friend Mrs. Trevelyan, who had spent 30 years as a clerk in a solicitor's office, and had never, in all that time, lost her taste for old scandals properly filed. "My dear Jane," it began, "what a puzzle you have set me, and what a sad little story it turns out to be underneath the puzzling. There had indeed been an Alice Dovewell, or rather, Mrs. Trevelyan wrote, an Alice Marsh, for that was the name under which the events had occurred, in the parish of St. Osyth's, Bethnal Green, in the year 1919. Alice Marsh had kept the accounts of a small benevolent fund for war widows, much as Miss Dovewell kept the accounts of the Harvest Fund now, and had been discovered, after some 2 years, to have quietly diverted a sum of money, not enormous, but far from trivial, toward the support of a man named Marsh, whom she called her husband, though the parish records showed no marriage had ever taken place, and who had, in point of fact, already been married elsewhere, and was shortly afterward imprisoned for bigamy and for a quite separate matter of fraud. Alice Marsh had not been prosecuted. The fund's trustees, embarrassed by the whole affair and unwilling to see it in the newspapers, had allowed her to make what restitution she could and quietly disappear from the parish, on the understanding that the matter would never be spoken of again. She had gone, so far as anyone could trace, to live under her mother's maiden name, Dovewell, in a village some considerable distance to the west. "There is one more thing," Mrs. Trevelyan's letter continued, "which I think may interest you rather more than the rest. I made a few inquiries, as you asked, into whether anyone else had lately been asking after the same records, and it seems a Mr. Arthur Pruitt of your own parish wrote to the diocesan archivist not 2 months ago, describing himself as engaged upon a history of English parish choirs, and requesting, among a great many other perfectly innocent things, the old benevolent fund minute books of St. Asaph for the years just after the First War. I cannot say what he found there, Jane, but I think we may guess." Miss Marple read the letter twice, folded it very precisely along its original creases, and sat for some time with her hands in her lap, feeling the particular sadness that came, always, at this stage of such matters, not surprise, for she was very rarely surprised, but a kind of tired sorrow at the sheer, ordinary human wretchedness of it. A woman, young and foolish and very much in love with an unworthy man, making one mistake 35 years ago and building since an entire second life on the foundation of never being asked about it. It did not excuse murder, it explained it, which was a different thing, and a thing Miss Marple had learned, over a long life of watching her fellow creatures, to hold quite separately in her mind. She took the letter, that same afternoon, to Detective Inspector Corby, who read it twice while standing in his small office at the police house, and then sat down rather heavily, as though the chair had been waiting for him to need it. 35 years, he said at last, and a woman who's given nothing but flowers to this parish for 11 of them, so far as anyone here's ever known. It hardly seems possible. Put it like that, Miss Marple. A great many true things hardly seem possible, Inspector, put plainly in a police office on a Tuesday afternoon. That is rather why we so often fail to credit them until the evidence leaves us no other choice. Miss Marple folded her gloves in her lap, thinking of the small green account book and the photograph of a soldier who had never existed, and 35 years of dahlias tended with a devotion that had always, she now understood, been about a great deal more than flowers. I do not think, mind you, that Miss Dovewell set out that Thursday evening to kill anyone. I think she set out meaning only to plead with a man who had, in his own way, been rather cruel to her, cruel with the particular blindness of someone who believes himself entirely in the right, and that something in her, worn thin by weeks of dread, simply broke, in the space of a very few seconds, in a way she will very likely spend the rest of her life failing to fully understand herself. That's no defence in law, ma'am. No, Miss Marple agreed. It very rarely is. But it is, I think, very often the truth, and the truth and the law do not always sit as comfortably together as one might wish. Chapter 14. The Quiet Test. She chose the harvest supper for it, because a harvest supper is a gathering at which everyone watches everyone else without appearing to, and because Miss Dovewell, as keeper of the Flower and Harvest Fund, would certainly be present, moving among the trestle tables with her usual anxious, helpful competence, refilling teapots and straightening the rows of marrows and squash laid out for judging. The church hall had been decked out in the usual autumn fashion. Corn dollies strung along the rafters, a great pyramid of apples on the judging table, and the particular warm, close smell of a room crowded with damp wool coats and hot tea urns after a cold walk through the fog. The vicar said a short grace, rather more solemn than usual, in memory of Arthur Pruitt, and the choir, thinner by one voice and rather subdued, sang the harvest hymn a shade more quietly than in years past. Miss Marple, seated at the end of a long trestle table between Mrs. Latching and old Mr. Pargeter, watched the room fill and settle, noting, as she always did at such gatherings, who sat near whom, and who found reasons not to sit near whom at all. Miss Marple positioned herself near the tea urn, where she could see the doorway, and waited until Miss Dovewell came within easy speaking distance, and then said, in the mild conversational tone she reserved for remarks of the greatest importance, "I hear Dr. Haverford has sent the vestry teacup away for proper analysis after all. Miss Dovewell, the one that was found on the windowsill. Rather a relief, I think, to have it settled scientifically, one way or the other. And they tell me the London solicitor's clerk, who corresponded with poor Mr. Pruitt, is coming down himself next week to help the police go through his papers. So thorough, these young men, aren't they? They leave no thread unpulled." She watched, over the rim of her own teacup, with the particular unhurried attention she brought to such moments, as Miss Dovewell's hand, steady until that instant, pouring tea with the ease of 11 years' practice, checked, very slightly, so that a thin stream of tea ran past the cup's edge onto the white cloth beneath. Miss Dovewell did not cry out, or drop the pot, or do anything at all that another observer might have remarked upon. She simply stood very still for perhaps 2 seconds, her face composed into its usual expression of mild, anxious helpfulness, and then said, in a voice not quite her own, "How dreadful, I've spilled it. I do hope it hasn't marked the cloth. Mrs. Latching will be so cross. She only had it laundered Tuesday." It was, Miss Marple thought, watching her mop carefully at the small stain, a very small thing indeed to build a certainty upon. A spilled inch of tea, a sentence about laundry, offered a half-second too promptly, as though reaching for the nearest ordinary thing to say, and finding it, gratefully, close to hand. But Miss Marple had watched a great many people receive a great many pieces of unwelcome news over a great many years, and she had learned that guilt, when it is well disguised everywhere else, will very often surface first and most honestly in the hands. She let a little time pass, speaking of the judging and the fine size of Mr. Pargeter's marrows, before trying the smaller, second thread of her test, offered as lightly as the first. "I walked the footpath by Hobbsfield only yesterday, Miss Dovewell. Such a pretty way to the crossroads, though I confess I hadn't realised quite how close it brings one round to the back of the churchyard. One could very nearly see the vestry window from the stile, on a clear evening." This time Miss Dovewell did not spill anything at all, which told Miss Marple a good deal more than a second spill would have done, for it is the very great effort of holding perfectly still that betrays a person a moment after the surprise has passed, once they have understood, a beat too late, that stillness itself may be its own kind of confession. Miss Dovewell smiled, said something pleasant and entirely unremarkable about the prettiness of the Hobbsfield path in autumn, and moved on with her teapot to the next table, but her hand, Miss Marple noted, did not stop trembling, very slightly, for the better part of 10 minutes afterward. She said nothing further that evening. There would be time enough, and it seemed to her both kinder and wiser that what followed should happen quietly, over tea, with no crowd of neighbours to turn a private tragedy into a public spectacle. Chapter 15. Tea for two in Rose Cottage. She went the next afternoon to Miss Dovewell's cottage, a small, neat house at the end of Church Lane, with dahlias, rather too many dahlias, crowded into every available border, as though the woman who tended them needed always to have her hands full of something living and growing, and entirely under her control. The last of the afternoon light lay thin and gold across the borders, the sort of light that comes only in the final days before the first hard frost, and Miss Marple paused a moment at the gate, looking at the neat rows of blooms, thinking that a woman who tended a garden with such devotion generally did so because the garden asked nothing of her that she was not entirely willing to give, which was, perhaps, more than could be said of most of the people in her life. Miss Dovewell opened the door herself, and if she was surprised to see Miss Marple standing there in the thin autumn sunlight, she gave no sign of it beyond a slight, quick intake of breath, quickly mastered. "I wondered if you might call," she said. "Won't you come in? I've just got the kettle on." They sat, the two of them, in a small sitting room crowded with the particular clutter of a solitary life, carefully arranged to look fuller than it was. China shepherdesses, a piano no one played, a single silver-framed photograph on the mantel of a young soldier in uniform, whose face, Miss Marple noted, bore only the most general resemblance to anyone at all, the sort of photograph that might have been bought, quite easily, in any second-hand shop. A fire had been laid but not lit, and the room held the particular chill of a house whose owner has grown accustomed to being cold, rather than trouble another soul with the asking of coal. "That is not your fiancé, is it, Miss Dovewell?" Miss Marple said, not unkindly, once the tea had been poured. "I don't believe there ever was a fiancé lost at the Somme. I believe there was a man named Marsh in Bethnal Green, in the year 1919, who was already married to someone else, and who went to prison for it, and I believe Mr. Pruitt found that out from an old minute book at St. Osyth's, and felt it was his Christian duty to see the fund's trustees informed, since you have, I think, been managing this parish's harvest money in very much the same way you once managed that one." The silence that followed was long, and in it Miss Marple watched a curious transformation take place. Not collapse exactly, but a kind of settling, as though a great weight, carried a very long time, had finally been permitted to come to rest. "He wasn't cruel about it at first," Miss Dovewell said at last, very quietly, her hands folded in her lap and quite still now, all their earlier anxious motion gone. "He wrote to me, a private letter, before the ones from London started coming so often, and said he understood these things happened, that youth and love made fools of everyone once, and that he only wished me to resign quietly from the fund, on some pretext, health or age, and he'd say nothing further. I could have borne that. I was ready to bear it." Her voice hardened, very slightly. "But then the London letters kept coming, closer and closer to the truth of the money as well as the man, and I understood he wasn't satisfied with my quiet resignation any longer. He'd found the shortfall too, you see, in the account books. Not the great scandal, but the smaller one, the pounds and shillings I'd taken over the years, a little each time, never meaning to keep taking, always meaning to pay it back, and never quite managing to. He meant to have it all out at the Harvest Committee, in front of everyone. 35 years of being Miss Dovewell of the Flowers, undone in one evening, in front of the whole village. "Tell me about the man, Miss Dovewell, about Marsh." Miss Marple asked it gently, but she asked it, for she had learned, over a long life, that a confession properly heard is a kindness as much as an investigation, and that a woman who has carried a secret 35 years is very often glad, in the end, of one honest chance to set it down whole. "He was handsome, and he was kind to me, and I was 22, and had never had a man look at me the way he looked at me, and I asked no questions I ought to have asked." Miss Dovewell's eyes had gone distant, fixed on some point beyond the little sitting-room, beyond the dahlias, beyond 35 careful years. "He told me his wife had died in the influenza, and I believed him, because I wanted to believe him, and it was only after the money was gone, after the trustees came to me with their dreadful, kind, quiet faces, that I learned she was living still, in Portsmouth, and had never been ill a day in her life. I gave him the money because he told me she'd left him with debts he couldn't clear, and I believed that too, and by the time I understood what a fool I'd been, I'd broken faith with every widow whose few shillings I was meant to be guarding." She drew a long, unsteady breath. "I never saw him again after his trial. I don't know if he's living or dead, and God forgive me, I stopped caring a very long time ago. But I could not go on being Alice Marsh, who had done that, in any place where anyone might ever learn of it. So I became Miss Dovewell, who did the flowers, and I told myself if I was careful enough and quiet enough and useful enough to everybody, no one would ever think to ask who I'd been before." Miss Marple listened to all of this without interruption, her hands folded quietly in her lap, thinking that she had heard some version of this same story a great many times in her long life, though rarely told with such unflinching honesty, and never before, she reflected, from a woman who had gone on, at the very end of it, to commit the one act that honesty could no longer undo. It was a strange and sorrowful thing, she thought, that a woman capable of speaking so plainly now, in this small, chilly sitting-room, had spent 35 years unable to speak plainly to anyone at all, and had found, in the end, that the silence itself had done a good deal more damage than the truth, however painful, could ever have done. So you went to him on Thursday, with your chrysanthemums, and your own heart drops in your basket alongside them. Miss Dovewell looked up, and there was, in her face, something almost like relief at being, at last, entirely known. I only meant to talk to him. I told myself that, walking up the lane. But I'd brought the drops, my own prescription, for my heart. The doctor gave me ages ago, and I've hardly needed it since, because some small, dreadful part of me had already decided, before I let myself know it. He was cross about the flowers, same as always, turned his back on me to fuss over his music, and his own bottle was standing open on the table beside his teacup, where he'd already taken his ordinary dose not 5 minutes before. And it was so very easy, Miss Marple. That's the terrible thing about it. It took perhaps 4 seconds, and no courage at all, only a kind of numbness. And then I was out of the door, and down the lane, and onto my bus exactly on time, as though nothing in the whole world had happened. Did he say anything to you before you left him? Miss Dovewell's hands tightened in her lap. He said he was glad I'd come round to sense at last, and that he'd tell the committee I'd resigned for reasons of health, and spare me the worst of it, since I'd shown, in the end, the decency to accept what was fair. He was almost kind about it, Miss Marple, in that last moment, kinder than he'd been in weeks. I think that is the thing I shall carry longest. Not the fear of him, but the ordinary, decent kindness in his voice. Not 5 minutes before I did what I did. She shook her head slowly, as though trying to shake the memory loose from where it had lodged itself. I have wondered, since, whether I would have found the courage to walk away if he had only gone on being cruel. It is a dreadful thing to owe your own crime, even in part, to a moment of somebody else's ordinary goodness. And the spectacles? He'd taken them off to rub his eyes, cross about something in the music, and set them on the table. I don't know why I took them. Some notion, I think, of making it look as though he'd fumbled the dose himself, poor eyesight and all, dosing blind. I meant to leave them somewhere ordinary, but I lost my nerve on the bus, and pushed them down into my own apron pocket instead, meaning to dispose of them properly later, and then I simply didn't. I couldn't make myself go near the mill pond with them, or the church, without feeling every eye in the village was on me. So they sat in the shed, in my own apron, for a fortnight, and I told myself no one would ever look. But someone did look, Miss Marple said gently. And I think, Miss Dovewell, when Tommy Renfield found them, and began telling everyone exactly how he'd found them, hidden deep, pushed down under the twine, not merely dropped, you understood at once what that detail would mean to anyone paying proper attention. And I think you went to the mill pond that Tuesday morning not by chance, but because you knew Tommy passed that way to school, and you were frightened enough by then to do something you would once have thought yourself entirely incapable of doing. Miss Dovewell did not deny it. She sat very still, her tea going cold beside her, and after a long moment she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I have never in my life done a violent thing, Miss Marple. Not once, in 58 years, and I have done 2, now, inside a single fortnight, and I hardly know the woman who did them. I only know I could not bear, a second time, to have 35 years undone in a single evening in front of people who thought they knew me." "You did not push very hard," Miss Marple said, after a moment, choosing the words with care, for it seemed to her important, even now, to make the small distinctions that truth required. "The boy is bruised and frightened, and no more, and I think, Miss Dovewell, that some part of you knew, even as you did it, that you could not truly bring yourself to harm a child, and pulled the blow before it was fully struck. That is not innocence. But it is not quite the same thing, either, as the woman who measured out a fatal dose without a second's hesitation, and I think you know the difference better than anyone." Miss Dovewell's composure broke then, at last, not into weeping, but into something quieter and more exhausted, a long, shuddering breath, and her hands coming up briefly to cover her face, before falling still again in her lap. "I stood on that millstone afterward, when he'd gone in the water and the carter was shouting for help, and I thought, quite calmly, that I ought to walk into the pond myself and have done with the whole wretched business. And then I thought of my dahlias needing lifting before the frost, of all the foolish, ordinary things, and I walked home instead and put the kettle on and told myself I had imagined the whole afternoon. One can tell oneself a great many things, Miss Marple, if one has had 35 years of practice at it. Chapter 16. What the Bottle Told Them. Detective Inspector Corby came that same evening, at Miss Marple's quiet insistence, and Miss Dovewell received him with a strange, almost peaceful composure, as though the confessing itself, once begun, had used up whatever store of fear she had left. She told it all again, in shorter and plainer words than she had used with Miss Marple, and Corby wrote it down in his notebook with the careful, faintly disbelieving thoroughness of a man who had been entirely certain, a fortnight before, that he already had his murderer safely under suspicion in the person of a proud young tenor. It was, when laid out complete, a simple enough sequence, for all the trouble it had given. Arthur Pruitt, delving into old parish minute books for what he had told everyone was an amateur's history of English choirs, had stumbled instead upon an old and carefully buried scandal, and had felt, not maliciously, Miss Marple believed, but with the particular blindness of a righteous man, convinced he is only doing his duty, that the Harvest Fund could not, in conscience, remain in the hands of a woman who had once mishandled a very similar trust. He had written to Miss Dovewell privately first, offering her the mercy of a quiet resignation, but his own inquiries had continued alongside that mercy, growing closer each week to the second and smaller truth of the missing pounds and shillings in her own account book, until mercy and threat had become, in her frightened understanding, one and the same thing. On Thursday she had gone to the vestry with her flowers and her fear, and folded small in her coat pocket the bottle of heart drops she had carried, unused, for years. She had emptied a large measure of it into his open medicine bottle while his back was turned, adding it to a dose he had, by unhappy chance, already taken not 5 minutes before, a second, unwitting dose, stacked upon the first, more than sufficient, Dr. Haverford confirmed once he knew what to test for, to stop a heart already weakened by years of poor health. She had taken his spectacles in a moment of confused, unplanned impulse, meant to suggest a blind man's fatal error, and had lost her nerve to dispose of them properly, hiding them instead in her own marked apron, the single, damning inconsistency in an otherwise carefully ordinary crime. "The apron troubled me from the first," Miss Marple said, when Corby asked her, later, how she had come to it. "A clever woman, having just committed murder, does not hide the evidence in the one place in the village bearing her own initials. But a frightened woman, acting on impulse and regretting it within the hour, does exactly that, because she is thinking only of getting the dreadful object out of her own hands, and not at all of where a policeman might later look. Once I understood the spectacles were hidden from panic rather than placed from calculation. The rest was only a matter of asking who had reason to panic, and Mrs. Fenwick's account of the Crossroads bus stop did the remainder of the work for me. The teacup, sent away at last for proper analysis, confirmed what Dr. Haverford had already begun to suspect. Traces of a second, more concentrated preparation, quite distinct from the tincture in Pruitt's own bottle, sufficient on its own to account for the speed and severity of his collapse. Miss Dovewell's own prescription, fetched from her cottage and compared against it by a chemist brought down specially from Milchester, matched it precisely, down to the particular bitter compound her own doctor had favoured for weak hearts in elderly patients for the better part of 20 years. She was committed for trial at the winter assizes, and pleaded guilty on the advice of her solicitor, sparing the village the ordeal of a lengthy public hearing, though the newspapers made what they could of the little that was said in open court. A respectable spinster of 58, keeper of the parish flowers, undone at last by a scandal 3 decades old. Miss Marple did not attend the proceedings. She had, she told Mrs. Bantry, seen quite enough of the matter already, and had no wish to watch a frightened, exhausted woman stand alone in a public dock to answer for a crime that had begun, in truth, 35 years before, in a very different courtroom she had never had to stand in at all. "It seems a hard thing somehow," Mrs. Bantry said, over their weekly game of patience, "that Marsh, whoever he was, walked free of it all those years ago, and she's the one who pays for the whole sorry business now." "It very often is a hard thing," Miss Marple agreed, laying down a card with the particular care she brought to games of chance, as much as to matters of far greater weight. "Justice is a clumsy instrument, my dear, however carefully we try to sharpen it, and it has a regrettable habit of falling hardest upon those who were, at the very beginning, more sinned against than sinning, though that can never quite excuse what came after, however much sympathy one may feel for what came before." Chapter 17. A quiet evening at the vicarage. The village took the news, as villages do, in stages. First disbelief, for Miss Dovewell of the flower rota was among the last person anyone would have named. Then a flurry of retrospective certainty, as half of little Hadbury recalled small oddities in her manner they had somehow failed to remark upon at the time, and finally a kind of subdued, uneasy quiet, the particular quiet of a small community that has discovered a stranger living, undetected, inside a familiar face for 35 years. Mrs. Latching, for her part, told anyone who would listen that she had always found something not quite right about a woman who never once, in 11 years, spoke of her own people, though Miss Marple privately doubted this claim had occurred to Mrs. Latching before the previous Tuesday. The Harvest Festival went ahead as planned, a fortnight later, though a subdued one, with the flowers arranged that year by a small committee of 3, rather than by any single steady hand, and the chrysanthemums, some remarked, never looked quite so well as they had under Miss Dovewell's particular care, which seemed to Miss Marple a very small, very human sort of grief, the missing of a skill once one has lost the person who possessed it, quite apart from any grief for the person themselves. Prudence Aldous came to Miss Marple's cottage a week later, her coat properly buttoned this time, and sat with rather more ease than she had managed on her previous visit. "The bishop has been told the whole of it," she said. "Michael went himself, rather than wait for it to reach him some other way. He was very calm about it, calmer than I was, if I'm honest. Said a man's worth was hardly a matter of what his grandfather did or didn't sign his name to, and that if the parish thought less of him for it, the parish was welcome to think so, and he'd go on doing his duty regardless." She smiled, faintly, for the first time in weeks. "I think I married rather a better man than I gave him credit for being, Miss Marple, and it took Arthur Pruitt's death to teach me so, which seems a dreadfully expensive lesson." "It very often is," Miss Marple said gently. "We rarely learn the true worth of the people around us, except through some crisis that forces the question. It is one of the small mercies hidden inside a great many tragedies, though it is cold comfort to the person who did not survive to see it." Simon Annesley, cleared entirely and rather chastened by how close suspicion had come to settling permanently upon him, was heard, at the following Sunday's service, singing the descant Arthur Pruitt himself had once refused to let him attempt, and singing it, several people remarked, rather better than anyone had expected. Word came, some weeks later, that the cathedral choir at Milchester had offered him a place after all, the new choir master being a good deal less inclined than Pruitt had been to hold a young man's temper against his talent, and the whole village turned out, rather to Annesley's embarrassment, to see him off at the railway station with more warmth than his pride would allow him to properly acknowledge. Miss Hetty Skirrow was given the harmonium permanently, and proved, once the shock of the whole business had worn off, a good deal steadier a musician than her nervous chatter had suggested, though she never did entirely lose the habit of filling every silence with more words than the occasion strictly required. Mr. Hobden went on clipping the churchyard hedges exactly as he always had, and told the story of the 5th letter, in time, to anyone who asked and a good many who didn't, though he was careful, Miss Marple noticed, never quite to claim he had suspected the truth of it himself, which was, she thought, only honest of him. Detective Inspector Corby called on Miss Marple once more before the assizes, to thank her, a little stiffly, for her assistance, and to admit, with the particular grace of a young man learning an old lesson early in his career, that he had been entirely wrong about Simon Annesley, and entirely too slow to look past a bottle standing conveniently open on a table. "I'll not make that mistake again, ma'am," he said, turning his hat in his hands at her cottage door. "Looking only at what's put in front of me, I mean, and not asking who might have put it there." "You will make it again, Inspector," Miss Marple said, not unkindly, "for we all do, again and again, being human. The trick is only to remember, each time, that you have made it before, and to look a little sooner the next time. That is all any of us can manage, and it is generally enough." Miss Dovewell's cottage stood empty within the month, the dahlias left to the frost, and though the village spoke of her, from time to time, with the particular mixture of pity and unease reserved for a familiar face turned suddenly strange, no one, in Miss Marple's hearing, ever spoke of her with real hatred. There was too much sadness in the whole affair for hatred to take proper root. A woman who had spent 35 years building a small, safe, orderly life out of the wreckage of one youthful mistake, and had, in the end, destroyed it entirely trying to keep it from being seen. Chapter 18. What Miss Marple Understood. On the last evening of that autumn, with the fog come down again over the churchyard and the harvest safely gathered, Miss Marple sat by her own fire with her knitting idle in her lap, thinking, as she often did at the close of such matters, not about the puzzle solved, but about the ordinary human weakness underneath it. She had gone once, before the assizes, to see Miss Dovewell in the small room set aside for such visits, though she had told no one in the village she meant to go, judging it a private matter, and none of little Hadbury's ordinary business. Miss Dovewell had seemed smaller there than she had ever seemed among her own dahlias, but calmer too, in a way that puzzled Miss Marple, until Miss Dovewell herself explained it. "I slept last night for the first time in a fortnight, Miss Marple, and slept soundly. Isn't that a strange thing to confess to, under the circumstances? But I've not had to be careful these last few days about what I say or how I hold my hands or whether my face gives anything away, and I find I'd forgotten what it was to simply exist without watching myself every moment. 35 years is a very long time to spend guarding a secret, and I find, now it's out, that the guarding was very nearly as exhausting as the secret itself." Miss Marple had thought of that conversation often since, turning it over the way she turned over most things that troubled her, not because it excused what had been done, for it did not, and could not, but because it seemed to her to hold some small, hard truth about the peculiar cruelty people inflict upon themselves in the keeping of secrets, quite apart from whatever cruelty the secret's discovery might later provoke them toward. It was not wickedness, in the end, that had killed Arthur Pruitt, or none that a village could easily name and be done with. It was fear, an old, common, entirely human fear of being known for what one has done rather than for what one has since become, magnified over 35 careful years until it grew large enough to reach, at last, for poison rather than face the alternative. Miss Marple had seen a great many murders in her long life, and she had come to believe, with a conviction she rarely spoke aloud, that very few of them sprang from anything so simple as wickedness. Most sprang from exactly this: an ordinary person, cornered by an ordinary fear, discovering too late how very far they were prepared to go rather than be seen plainly by their neighbours. She thought, too, of Arthur Pruitt himself, and found her feelings toward him a good deal less simple than the village's collective grief had allowed for. He had not deserved to die, certainly. No one, in Miss Marple's long experience, deserved that, however tangled their motives. But he had also, she thought, mistaken a private reckoning for a public one, had allowed the small human pleasure of possessing power over another person to disguise itself as righteousness, and had walked, quite blindly, into the very danger his own righteousness had created. It was a lesson, she thought, that applied to a great many people who considered themselves entirely on the side of virtue, and one the village would do well to remember, though she rather doubted it would. She thought of Prudence Aldous, brave enough at last to let her husband's parentage be known, and discover he loved her the better for her honesty. She thought of Miss Dovewell, who might, 35 years before, have told one true story, instead of building an entire second life to avoid telling it, and who had perhaps needed, all along, only a single person willing to hear the truth without flinching from it. The vicar's wife had kept 2 diaries that autumn, Miss Marple reflected, one of ordinary parish business, written for anyone to read, and one, kept only in her own frightened heart, of a secret she had been certain would destroy her, and it had not destroyed her, in the end, because she had found the courage, however lately, to close the second one and let it be read. Not everyone in Little Hadbury had managed the same. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, and the needles began their small, steady click in the quiet room. There was a letter from Raymond on the side table still, the same letter she had been thinking of that first foggy afternoon, before any of it began, and she had not yet properly answered it. She thought she might tell him a little of the whole affair, in the careful, general way she generally wrote of such things to her nephew, who found her interest in village murders faintly alarming and rather charming in equal measure, and who would, she suspected, tease her gently about it in his reply, as he always did, before asking, in the next line, exactly how she had known. She thought she would tell him only that a secret kept too long becomes a burden heavier than almost any truth, however painful, and that the people of Little Hadbury, like people everywhere, were mostly neither so good nor so wicked as they appeared, but simply frightened, in their various ordinary ways, of being seen too clearly by those around them. It was not, she thought, a very cheerful lesson to send a young man in London, but it was, she believed, a true one, and Miss Marple had always found that true things, however unwelcome, wore rather better in the end than comfortable ones. Outside, the fog settled once more over the sleeping village, patient, indifferent, keeping, as fog always does, its own long silence about everything it had seen.